We come here, folks, to our Saturday morning devotions, and we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. And if you've got a Bible, I encourage you to read along with myself. So, verse 12 of Philippians 1. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defence of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. We need to remember that the subject of this letter is joy, and Paul is wanting to deal with anything that will rob the Philippians of the joy that they have in Jesus Christ. And he's dealing here with this section with two things that were in danger of doing that. The first of all was their worry about his imprisonment. The second thing was concern over rival preachers. As we think first of all of Paul's imprisonment, what Paul does is to speak to the Philippians about what are some of the results of him being imprisoned. First of all, he mentions in verses 12 to 13 of how the gospel has spread. He speaks of the gospel even spreading among the imperial guard. They are now knowing that indeed the reason why Paul is in prison because of Christ. The message of Christ is getting into the very heart of Rome and into the very heart of the emperor's household. And so Paul's imprisonment, he's saying, it's not something to be unduly concerned about. It's part of God's plan for the spread of the gospel. And then he speaks about, in verse 14, of gospel confidence that has now come among the other believers in Rome because of what has happened to Paul and Paul's response. They are now encouraged to speak more boldly for Jesus. So here we see something that looked out to be harmful, looked to be something going against the purposes of God, is actually being turned around God and bringing about good, bringing about the spread of the gospel and upbuilding God's people. The second issue then Paul has to deal with from verse 15 on is the issue of rival preachers. He speaks here in verse 15 about two types of preachers. Those who are good and those who are bad. The good preachers in verse 16 are those who preach out of love, out of a love for Christ, out of love for other people. They have a delight in the gospel and that's why they preach it. Others, he says there in verse 17, preach out of selfish ambition. They preach the message of Christ, but it's to make a name for themselves, is to lift them up and put others down. Now, we have to be very careful as to what are our motives in serving Christ. Are we doing it out of a love for Christ, out of a love for others? Or are we doing it out of selfish ambition? Are we doing it to make a name for ourselves? We have to be so careful about this. It's Christ deserves that we do everything out of a love for him, and people will see the difference. Indeed, Paul speaks of how those who preach out of selfish ambition, they're wanting to hurt him. They're thinking he's in prison and he hears how they're being successful, it will harm him. But look at Paul's attitude that we see here in verse 18. He says, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. And Paul is saying, as these people think that they'll get me down by preaching out rivalry, I don't care. I don't care why they're doing it. But Christ's name is being honoured. Christ's name is being lifted up. The gospel is advancing at that time. And here we see that in regards to those two situations, Paul's imprisonment and these rival preachers, the way Paul can look at those things and not rob him of his joy is Paul looks at a bigger picture. He looks at the big picture of what God is doing. And as we look today at the situation in our land with the coronavirus and the situation of our so much challenges for people in the works and so forth, so much challenge for churches and how God's people are not going to come together, we do need to look at the big picture. Look at what else is happening. Think of how many gospel messages this weekend will be proclaimed across the internet. The church is moving outside of its walls. And there's hundreds and hundreds of people already this week have watched messages from Christian preachers who would not otherwise have done so. And so the way that we are able to face difficult situations and trials and not let them rob us of our joy is to look at the big picture. God's in control. God is working out his purposes, and God's purposes will succeed. We need to have that confidence in our great God. Tomorrow's Sunday, and we'll not be having the morning devotions, but we'll be having a service, and that will be published or put online at 11:30. And I hope if you're not involved in watching another church that you go to, you'll be very welcome to join us then at 11:30 for that service. Thank you very much.